So this one, we're thinking we're taking refuge until we're enlightened. In other words, we're deciding to rely upon the teachings of the Buddha himself, and the Dhamma, the Sangha, until I'm enlightened. Why? Oh, that's the first point. And why is so that I can become a Buddhist being of sentient beings. That's the plan, you know. Sangye charang soke chognam la janchu paru dagni kyap suchi dagi chunyen gi personam ki drola penche sangye drupa shog sangye charang soke chognam la janchu paru dagni kyap suchi dagi chunyen gi personam ki drola penche sangye drupa shog Sangye charang soke chognam la Jancho baru dagni kyap suchi Dagi chunyen gipe sonam ki Drola penche sangye drupa shog. Okay, I'm just going to do something to my lighting in this room. Just 1 second. I won't be a second. No difference. Don't worry. Okay, people. Okay, I hope you all got your course notes. And so, of course, as always, you know, I might be saying different things in different ways, and you read your course notes and you're learning something more. So it's really crucial during these courses that, you know, you read the course notes, you study the course notes, because there's masses of information in there, more detail probably than I'm giving. So why is there a course? Why is there this module on, you know, death and rebirth? Why is that? What's the point? Well, it's touching on, you know, the fundamental, one of the fundamentals underpinning one of Buddha's fundamental observations, because remember, Buddha's not a creator. He doesn't make things up. He doesn't create things. He observes. So what Buddhism is what he has observed to be true. This is something to continue to remember, you know. I mean, obviously, you listen to a Christian, they're telling you that they say what is true. If you hear a mathematician, they're telling you what is true. So that's the really important point. You have to believe it, you check it out, and slowly you make it your own knowledge. That's your decision. So why impermanence? Well, first of all, one approach, one thing, impermanence is you know, the word they use in Buddhism, one of these basic ways that things exist. And one of the key things, the key ways of framing all of Buddha's teachings, and it's sort of obvious if you think it through, is he's telling us, as I said, he's telling us from his point of view, from his observation, not his intellectual speculation, but actual experiential observation. He's telling us that things change. Well, initially we think, well, yeah, I mean, excuse me, we know that already. Can I kindly have something more exciting to hear? But he's telling us that even though we intellectually know this is one of his first, one of his first teachings, basically. And it's a more, in terms of complexity and in terms of difficulty of comprehending, it's actually a lot easier than, for example, the philosophy about how things have no inherent nature, emptiness. This is simple, quite simple. But why is he telling us about it? Why is he telling us about it? This is the experiential point of view, because he is saying that right now we're living in la-la land and completely believing the opposite. And he said we can prove that fairly easily if we look at our behavior, you know. So in a sense, it's like a starting point. Remember the goal, the long-term goal, the final result of all this hard work of internalizing Buddha's teachings is, as I always pointed out, it's indicated by this word Buddha. Bud implies the eradication of all the misconceptions in the mind, the delusions, the emotional afflictions, these different words you will see in the Buddhist texts. And one of the results of removing these misconceptions from the mind, and misconception is the key word here, it's the key factor, it's the key energy of all the disturbing emotions, that misconceptions, meaning when we're caught up in these misconceptions, we are blinded from seeing things correctly, seeing things as they are, seeing reality, whatever words you like, And that initially is hard to see, because it's, in a sense, it's like you've believed for so long, every time you see 50 euros, you really believe it's 500. It's a simple example of a misconception. And the more you're convinced it's 500, the more literally it even appears to you as 500. And when you hear it's 50, you laugh. It's such a silly, ridiculous, it's 500, because you've got a misconception. And we all know ourselves, when you have a misconception, that's what you see. Like if you believe your sister stole from you and you believe it every day, you think of her as a thief, you see her as a thief, you paint a picture of this person as a thief. So you believe in absolutely total truth that she is a thief. But let's say you discover finally that it's not true. Initially, it's hard to believe it because your view is so entrenched. The Buddha's saying, that's how we all are, to one degree or another. And that's what he means when he says we are in samsara, quote unquote. Samsara, I don't know what the literal word means, but being in samsara means literally being caught up in these different levels of emotional dramas, which have this function of causing us not to be in touch with reality. So if you thought that 1 + 1 was 4, then you'd say a person isn't in touch with reality. You believe it's 4, you're convinced it's 4, you try to prove it's 4, and every time you discover, your expectations aren't met, then you're disappointed, aren't you? Well, that's why we suffer, Buddha says. This is the basic reason in Buddhism. This is the fundamental reason, as far as Buddha is concerned, across the board, why we suffer is because we've got misconceptions in the mind. And this is a curious idea, because this is not how we think. We think we suffer because it rained. We think it's suffer because someone punched me. We think we suffer because of whatever. Not fundamentally, Buddha says that the core reason for our suffering is that we've got these misconceptions deep in the bones of our being. So what he's telling us is in this word Buddha, the first syllable, that when we're rid of that, this is the first part of the process of getting enlightened. We're rid of suffering and its causes. This is the framework of the entire Buddhist philosophical view. It's the basis of all the Buddhist psychology, metaphysics, you name it. We've got to remember that. It's not initially evident to us, So he tells us his findings. He tells us that things actually are impermanent. They are not, as he says, we believe instinctively, even though intellectually we disagree with it, that things, they're sort of set in stone, And there's two ways that Buddha teaches impermanence. One, they call it literally coarse or gross impermanence. There's a much more subtle level, and they literally call it subtle impermanence. And this actually can be confused with the meaning of emptiness, because it's much more subtle and it's harder to cognize, and it's only really in subtle meditation, in the subtle level of your mind, that you can cognize this reality. But the one here in this packaging of Buddha's teachings that we know is the Lam Rim, the very first one that Atisha lays down that we need to become familiar with is the general teachings on impermanence. But not just that, his specific approach is he wants us to cognize, to internalize, to experience the truth of the gross impermanence of one's own death. So there's kind of two birds, he's killing two birds with one stone here. One is we are presented with this teaching of impermanence, and we start to become familiar with it, and we apply it in our entire daily life. But the other one is he wants us to get a wake-up call, putting it into this position in the Lam Rim, which is actually quite at the beginning. He wants us to get the wake-up call, realizing this life is precious, and given that it is, like everything else in the universe, impermanent, it's changing moment by moment and soon will end, that we don't want to waste this precious life. And so that's the real agenda here, why death is the example of impermanence, not say just your house, your relationship, your table, your chairs. They're also exactly the same. There's no difference. But the most powerful one is this idea that I am impermanent. And this is pointing to a particularly powerful misconception, a particularly powerful emotional misconception, as Lama Zopa calls it, this grasping at permanent me. So what this does is it wakes us up, but also it leads us to the more subtle understanding of, well, there's no inherent me in the first place, you know. But we've got to get this one first. So of course, what's implied, the bigger picture here in Buddhism is that the bigger picture is this idea of rebirth. So we all understand things are impermanent, and let's say you're a physical, you know, you're a materialist, you're a philosophical materialist. You too can also listen to these teachings and agree with them. Totally agree. Buddha's absolutely correct. He has a different approach. We're going to go through the points, the ways of internalizing this information, and you can get a wake-up call from that. And many people who have a feeling, who have the philosophical materialist view, who have no view of any kind of concept of a religious view of going on to another life, whether it's human or whether it's heaven, you can also get it as a wake-up call, because you'll then realize you don't want to waste this precious life. You want to make the most of it and be of use to others, be beneficial to others. So when you do die and disappear into a black hole or whatever, that you at least leave something decent behind. That's good enough. Nothing wrong with that. But that's not the main point here for the Buddha. The main point, of course, is that because, as far as he is concerned, your mind not only will continue to another life, but the bigger picture here is that it came from a previous life. So we need to look at this whole idea of this concept of reincarnation, this concept of rebirth, which of course is fundamental in Buddhism, because as we know from the very first module about the mind, one of the first points that's implied by this concept of reincarnation, and therefore coming from a previous life and going to another previous life, what's implied by that is, you know, the big question we have is, well, then when did I begin? If you're a philosophical materialist, you know, you began. I live in Paris. I'm in Paris in this apartment. There's lots of little tiny ants. They're so tiny you can't see them, but you can feel them tickling you. So miniature. On my computer as well. Look at them. Okay, so you know, is that the implication of this is that it brings the question, which is a very primordial question for us, but which for Buddha is a non-question. It's a mistaken question. When did I begin? You know. So clearly, if you're a Christian, you too agree with the Buddha to one degree or another that you won't end at death, that you'll go on to either heaven or hell or whatever. The Muslims agree. Other religions have similar ideas. Many other people around the world, philosophical ideas about what continues. We know the philosophical materialists would say we are only the physical and we'll turn into dust when we die. But the Christian view, for example, is that you don't come from a previous life. We say we come from a creator, that God made our soul and put the soul in there, in the egg and sperm, when our mummy and daddy did their job of giving us a body, you know. Muslims think that as well. Other people think that. And then the Buddha view is different there. We don't need creating. There is no creator. This is what we're going to go into in more depth when we talk about karma. But consciousness or mind come from, they're their own entity. So we're taking the hypothesis here, of course, that they're not physical, and that, you know, this capacity for cognition, this mental continuum, this consciousness, this mind, these words are all broadly synonymous. It's a continuity of mental moments, and this moment of my cognition comes necessarily from a previous moment. And then if you get right back to the first second of conception, you have to logically say the same thing. This moment of my consciousness at that first moment of conception, when the egg and sperm first met, and my consciousness doesn't come from the egg and doesn't come from the sperm and doesn't come from nothing and doesn't come from a creator. So it could only come from this perspective, from a previous moment of itself. And then we think, well, maybe I began in the last life, you know, oh, maybe I began in the previous life. But you keep rigorously taking this simple principle that at this moment of my mind, it's what do they call it? Substantial. They have many different ways of describing causes. Substantial cause, the substance. If it's not physical, which is a pretty abstract concept, we can't get our head around that, then the only thing that can be the substantial cause of it as a previous moment of something similar, a previous moment of cognition, not someone else's, one's own. I mean, in a simple sense that, for example, you know, if you're playing the piano, and in other words, you've got this knowledge in your mind, you've programmed yourself with music. So that moment of music, that moment of knowledge in your mind, because mind is knowledge. Mind is not some abstract thing. I mean, it is abstract in a way, but that not being not physical, it's being not physical. But it's whatever knowledge is in your mind. Think of mind like that. Whatever knowledge is in your mind. Well, you know perfectly well that moment of knowledge about music in your mind at this moment, its main source is the previous moment of knowledge of music in your mind. If you know that 1 + 1 is 2 now, that came from the previous moment of whatever level of that knowledge you had in the moment before. In other words, it's a growing, organic, step-by-step series of thoughts, basically. For the Buddha, the idea that someone can give you a mind, give you knowledge, give it to you, hand it over, is a very, very bizarre idea. The more one studies this concept of mind and how it functions, and it implies reincarnation. This is the only logical conclusion, the only logical deduction. The idea that your mother and father give you genes, Buddha does not argue with that, but he's saying genes, DNA, the chemicals, the body, the brain, he doesn't argue with that, but all he's saying is they are not your mind. Your mind is not a function. Your behavior, your mind, your sickness, your happiness, your whatever are not functions of the physical. I mean, the best way I put it is what's going on physically in our body are indicators of what is going on in our mind. Put it that way. So, of course, we can't prove this directly until we've got single-pointed concentration, until we've got shamatha, until we've got clairvoyance. So, of course, the only possibility is we take it as our working hypothesis. So your consciousness keeps going back. You know, this is the part that's kind of very weird for our minds. We always have this powerful question: when did it all begin? When did I begin? When did the universe begin? When did the earth begin? We're wanting all the first moments, want the first moments. That's nothing wrong with wanting, nothing wrong with looking into that. But the Buddha's view, actually, if you take the Vajrayana model, is that matter, which as far as that model is concerned, which is an ancient view, but it's still the one they use, is made of the 4 elements. So the 4 elements, whatever exists at this moment, right today, now, your mind, an apple, the planet, some of it is matter made of the 4 elements, and the rest of it are minds. And both of them are necessarily beginningless. Because if you can point to something that literally began at that moment, a first moment, then that means the law of cause and effect doesn't exist. Because by definition, cause and effect implies if there is this moment of something, it is the effect of a previous cause. So you can never find a first cause. Of course, as I mentioned, the Christians take that very seriously, and they have very serious philosophical teachings about how there can be a first cause, meaning God. Buddha disagrees. Philosophically, he disagrees. So the implication here is then the process, this mind, a continuity of mind, you know, and so then we have to, you know, look into this process of why we come into a certain life as a little tiny little baby, you know, tiny little squealy little baby, and then slowly we grow up, and then we start to get wrinkled, and then we die. Because why? Because things are impermanent. Because things are impermanent. Matter is impermanent. We know an apple, you watch an apple, and slowly it's going to rot. There's not a single thing that we know in this physical world that stays static, that we can see with our senses. And even a thing called the mind, which is what cognizes the objects of the senses, it too is impermanent. So the subtler energy of impermanence is that the subtler meaning of impermanence, the philosophy of impermanence, is that by definition, whatever is arising, within that is implying its cessation. Something like that, you know. Can't have one without the other. But we deal with gross impermanence, and we're going to deal in general with the gross impermanence of my cessation, the death of this person. And of course, by learning this and getting in touch with this, we get in touch with the impermanence of everything. But particularly, it's a wake-up call not to waste this precious life, you know. Because this grasping at permanent me and grasping at the things that we're attached to, especially as being permanent, causes us to live in la-la land. Because attachment can't stand the thought of not having that thing or this body or whatever, or that relationship. So we kind of desperately want it to be set in stone. We want it to stop changing. It's very painful. We suffer terribly because of this. It's fairly evident, isn't it? I mean, because we know instinctively from much experience of it, although we don't deal with it, that things are changing all the time, but we can't stand it when it comes to things we are really attached to. We can't bear the thought that our relationship will end. We can't bear the thought that that child will leave us, that things will change, that you'll lose that job. You know, we can't stand that. That's really clear. So this is why we suffer so much, because we're trying to stop things. We're trying to desperately hoping things will stop changing, but we know it's not possible. So it's something that we know from our experience, but we don't get in touch with it. We don't analyze it. We don't articulate it. We don't learn from it. You know, we kind of keep hoping, which is absurd. You know, you keep hoping you'll get the 500 euros worth one day from that 50 euro note. No, you'll keep bashing your head against a brick wall and keep suffering. So, of course, you know, in Buddhism too, it depends on where you go. If you go to a Zen class, you might not ever hear about reincarnation and karma. If you go to somewhere else, you might not hear, but this is, of course, in the Tibetan Buddhist monastic university system, which is directly coming from the great Nalanda tradition, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama always points out to us. This amazing system, amazing place of knowledge, study, and knowledge of Buddhism and Buddhist philosophy, psychology, all the rest, back 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th century. Eventually it collapsed. And then really, but in the 7th century, all the great masters, you know, who went from India to Tibet carried this tradition with them. It was unbroken and still existing in the Tibetan Buddhist monastic universities especially in the south of India, where the major monasteries are, you know. It's kept alive, but of course not just in the monastery bricks, but in the minds. Knowledge holder, it's a lovely word in Tibetan, knowledge holder, rigsen. This is where the knowledge is held, isn't it? In books, yes. In audio tapes, yes. But it's got to be held in a mind. So from this point of view, from the Nalanda tradition, there's extensive study and meditating on, becoming familiar with this bigger picture. And therefore also of universes and what universes are and where they come from and so on and so forth, you know. Because it's interesting, if we can think, if our mind is beginningless and has rebirth before going back in endless rebirths, then we have to deduce logically that we existed before this planet had human beings on it. So I mean, they don't go into this too much. There's not much study of this, I don't think, in Buddhist philosophy. Like that's how we mainly think in the West, isn't it? We look into the physical history. We try to get back to the first Big Bang and those creatures that lived before. They don't talk much about that in Buddhism. It's more just this idea, the principle implied by this idea of beginningless mind and therefore beginningless suffering, therefore beginningless karma, therefore beginningless universes, because a natural consequence of creating karma is that you have environments. We all live in environments. You don't just float in the sky. So that implies a planet, you know, implies universes, physical universes. So yes, indeed, you know, the Buddhist view, for example, would be that at this moment in time, from the billions of years point of view, we're in a very degenerate time. So a human birth is like the best of a bad lot. But basically, it's a very deluded rebirth. The main function, the key characteristic of a human mind, of a human rebirth, the key characteristic is that we have access to intelligence and virtue. It's an interesting point, you know. That's why human birth is the best of a bad lot, because you can utilize that intelligence to think through this entire process and then find methods to get rid of suffering and its causes, etc. So before, I mean, they don't talk about when humans started on this planet. I mean, we've got the scientific viewpoints, haven't we? We talk about, you know, all those, I don't know what's all those words they talk, all those evolution of humans, you know, looking like animals first and then getting cleverer as they go. But I wonder whether that's valid or not, because what a human is by definition is the virtue within us, is the intelligence. So the implication of that type of evolution, those dudes back then didn't look so intelligent to me, I'm not sure. So I don't necessarily think that's the beginning of humans. So this is where we have to really think differently, because the mind, you know, karma's like personal evolution. One life, you're born in a human body, so then you act like a human, you create karma like a human. But if you then act, that's the result of acting like virtuous karma, intelligence causes you to get a human life. But if in that human life, you misuse it and kill and steal and lie and practice wrong ethics, then you create the cause to go get born a snake. So your mind dies from a human body and you run to a mummy human snake. So evolution here isn't only the physical, because I mean, as far as the evolution view, the materialist one, a snake can only come from a snake, and we're only talking about the physical. They don't talk about a consciousness. But from the Buddhist point of view, you can be a human one life and a snake the next. So then you join the snake home and you do what snakes do. Then depending on how you act in that body, you get another body, and so on and so forth. So, you know, nothing wrong with evolution. But you can go from one house to go from a snake house to a human house to a ghost house, you know, you keep changing houses. So the thing is, a human body, then a human life, then they talk about this in the text. I don't know how extensive it is. I haven't studied enough to tell you. But I mean, a human life, they talk about it in eons ago, eons ago, you know, and that would be before this planet, before humans were occupying this planet. A human birth, because what is a human birth? You see, it's not just the physical, it's a type of mind, and minds are beginningless. So a human birth that would have been a very good birth was one that was much more subtle. The physical energy, the four elements manifested as like subtle light. So because the mind was much subtler and much purer and more ethical and more intelligent. So those lives lasted like 1,000 years or longer. You're super intelligent. There was no gross delusions, no gross attachment. Therefore, the body wasn't gross because they're very interconnected. And so that was a kind of a really powerful human life, and you can get enlightened fairly easily. But then delusions began to grow slowly over thousands, millions of years, probably. Delusions became manifest, and then that polluted the physical wind energies, which eventually caused us to be born on a planet looking like a bunch of apes. So it's in that sense, this is a very degenerate rebirth. You know, humans, I mean, our bodies are not made of light. That's a certainty. But nevertheless, of all the rebirths, it's said to be the best of a bad lot, because you can utilize the intelligence, utilize this virtue, you know. So the Buddha's idea of rebirth, karma is kind of the technicalities of how we get these different rebirths, and we'll discuss that in our karma module. But I find it just interesting, this idea, you know, of going from different bodies to bodies. And it's a tough one for us to understand, because it's not the way we think in our culture. But this is certainly Buddha's view. So as to what type of rebirth we get, that's determined by what we think and do and say, the process of quote unquote creating karma. But for me, I find it interesting how it's even possible that I can go from a human, this consciousness of mine can continue and then wake up in a snake mummy's egg, you know. It's kind of, I find that interesting. And that means we've got to stop, we've got to try to see the mind. And this is a bit of karma, and it's a bit of mind, it's a bit of all these things. I'm just talking here, my own things that I think about. So we have to see the mind. A snake is a mind showing certain propensities and then has a certain kind of body, you know, if you look at that. And the mind suits that body. And how come you are attracted to that body? That's due to the karma you create. You know, you act in a certain way, and then when you die, and we're going to go into this death process. This is part of our course, this module. A karmic seed is triggered from one of the millions of karmic seeds in your karmic seed bank vault, which is my term. and it's, let's say it would be a negative one in this case, a very heavy negative killing karmic seed. That's one of the karmas that is triggered. That causes you, already programs you to go to that snake mummy. I don't know how snakes have babies. Do they have sex? I know, maybe, I have no idea, but let's just pretend they do. So then you're attracted, you know, by the time you're in the bardo, and then when that new snake mummy and daddy do what they do, whatever they do, then you run like a magnet, super attracted to that particular shape, because that's the karma you create. You program yourself in advance to go to that kind of body, whatever the body is you end up with. So the only way to think about how to understand how rebirth can happen is that this is where we have to understand karma, which is going to come later. We create, all sentient beings are just a mind with certain tendencies, because you don't just get the body. There are 4 ways that karma arrives. We'll go into this later. You have, especially, you have the tendencies. So let's say a person who's got a strong, you know, tendency to, or whatever it might be, to kill. I mean, snakes are pretty heavy duty, aren't they? They like their breakfast to be alive. They have a tendency to kill, it looks like, isn't it? And if you look at a snake, and this is the thing, so I'm jumping around a bit, but if we look at sentient beings, you get a sense of their personality. If you look at someone's behavior, we don't think of animals this way, but this is a really important point. When you look at an animal behaving a certain way, that tells you about their mind, you know, that tells you about their mind. Some animal that's very aggressive, you're going to deduce they've got lots of anger and lots of aggression. Some animals are very scared, you know, they're very fearful, very timid. It's hardly rocket science. I mean, if you see that mummy lion stalking a buffalo for breakfast, getting her by the throat, ripping her guts out, and then eating it leisurely for breakfast, I think you can deduce what's in that mind. Because mind, the interesting part about Buddhist psychology, and I mentioned this, it refers to all sentient beings, not just humans, you know. So step back and stop seeing, oh, that's just the way lions are. No, have a look at its behavior. It will tell you about its mind, its tendencies, the habits in the mind, the habits, you know. So we create all of this. This is the Buddha's view. We create all these rebirths. I mean, you don't sit there like with a magic wand and create your future mother. She's there having sex with your future daddy. But you create the cause to have that kind of body with that kind of environment. And your mind, find your tendencies to kill or steal or lie or whatever, find a suitable body, you know, where you act like that animal or that human. All this is internal. All this is done by us. All this is created by us. It's a very fascinating view, in my opinion, you know. I mean, for me, it's like to have the idea that you're sent somewhere, which is the Christian view, that God sends you, punishes or rewards you. Nothing like that in Buddhism. It's much more organic, much more personal, much more subjective, much more organic, I would say, you know, evolutionary. So, okay, that's just my own thoughts, okay, but based on Buddhist teachings, so I'm not making things up. So the point then of becoming familiar with reincarnation, death, impermanence, rebirth, the bigger picture point of view is starting to realize that with your goal, we're heading, let's say we're on the Mahayana path. So our goal is to become a Buddha. You've got to know where you've got to know where you're heading. I mean, if you're studying math for 5 years, you've got to know what the goal is. What are you going to graduate as? Otherwise, there's no meaning, is there? If you're going to graduate as a musician, then everything you do on that path to becoming a musician has to help you become a musician. So getting this bigger picture of your mind being beginningless and endless, and that everything you think and do and say produces the person you become, which is karma, tells you. And you know from your own observation that lives don't last that long. I mean, we might meet some people or hear about 100, 105, 110 maybe. So we can see then, if you get the sense of impermanence, what you get is a sense of urgency, which is the real wake-up call to get, a sense of not wanting to waste time. So the more it's evident then, the more we can counteract this grasping at permanent me, kind of living in that kind of with tunnel vision. The more we can get that the more we will have this sense of not wanting to waste this precious life. Because when we understand karma, we realize everything we think and do and say, none of it goes astray. Everything we think and do and say is what produces the person I become, what produces my future life. And given that if we're intent upon becoming this Buddha, then we want to have the appropriate conditions. And the conditions for the Buddha, like I said, the best of a bad lot, the best birth to have is a human birth, you know. So again, we'll go into this in karma, but there's no harm in bringing it up now because it's very much to do with rebirth. Why you need a sense of urgency? I mean, if there were only human births, then we don't have to worry too much, you know, because you just know you're going to get another human birth. You get another human birth, but not for the Buddha. The more we understand karma, where we realize that, you know, following the cause, the main cause of just getting a human mother, getting a human body, not even the quality of it and nothing else, is non-killing. Generally speaking, and this is to do with karma, we'll go into this later, you know, the habit to not harm others, the practice of good ethics, specifically not killing, stealing, lying, etc., but particularly non-killing, the tendency of the buildup of that tendency in our mind is what programs us to get another one of those, another decent human body. So the bare minimum we need to carry on this path to achieve our long-term goal and not lose the plot is to continue to create the cause to get more human bodies. So what's behind then all the teachings on death and rebirth is to get this wake-up call so that you conclude I mustn't waste it. And what does wasting it mean? Or what not wasting it means not create. You want to create good ethics. You want to abide by the laws of karma. It's like a contemplation that you do before you even get to karma. So the general approach behind becoming familiar with impermanence is to not waste this precious life, because it doesn't last, and you might not get another one immediately after this one. In other words, you're so intent on wanting to become a Buddha that you want to make sure that you create the causes for another decent human body. That's the short term, if you like, goal. And then so with that, you become familiar with this idea of consciousness being beginningless and endless, and how it takes rebirth after rebirth. This is the Buddha's view. So, okay, so there's two main approaches to preparing ourselves for death, preparing ourselves for that point at which this mind will leave this body and then get another body. It's in a way, it's like an inconvenience, isn't it? What a drag. You've got to die and get another body. What a big drag, you know? So we've got to prepare ourselves to do that as well as possible so we don't make a mess of that transition. That's the point, you know? Because it's inconvenience. It's really boring, isn't it? Have to die and get another body. What a drag, you know? But that's the way it is, we can see. Okay, so there's two main, in the typical Lam Rim teachings, from the very first point in the Lam Rim, from taking from a teacher's little text, the light that guides you on your way, which is the basis of the Lam Rim, the very first thing to think about and become familiar with is this concept of death, of death, impermanence, but particularly death. And so the first way to, and this we're going to discuss, is the first way to think about, to contemplate, to become familiar with, is this one of is recognizing the reality of impermanence, and therefore completely changing the way you live your life. And then the other one is taking from the Vajrayana teachings, and that's the explanation of the death process itself. And that, of course, is you know, so this is where, even though when this course was first created, and Nick Rebush, whose course notes you'll be studying, this was before Lama Zopa's book was published. This was, you know, published a few years ago, and it's now available. Now it's in there as recommended reading. But I highly recommend it. I highly recommend it. It's a compilation of Lama Zopa's teachings, and it's helping us. It's framed. It's called How to Face Death Without Fear. And it's the whole point of it. It's written, it's addressing us as helpers of our loved ones. So, you know, whether it's a pussycat or your grandma, it's helping us know how best to help another person die well. And by implication, it's helping you to know how to die well, so that we can ensure as best as we can that they die well, so that they can another decent human rebirth, so they can keep on moving on their spiritual path. That's what's behind the point. The whole thing is that. So we'll be using that a lot as a basis of my discussions. And in that one, we'll discuss the actual process itself. And that's coming from the Vajrayana teachings. What happens is this process of this gradual deconstruction of the components that make up this person, which is what's called death. Then what happens after you stop breathing, when the mind leaves the body, what happens when the mind does leave the body, and you're in this intermediate state between rebirths, and then what happens when you get reborn, etc., etc. So of course, it's not, I mean, this is the key important point to get familiar with. But you don't just wait till that happens to learn about that. You have to live your life in such a way that you give up the fear of death, and you are ready for death, because you're realizing that the death is definite, the time of death is uncertain, and these things. So let's look first of all then at these points that Atisha discusses with us, of how in this daily life we try to counteract this deeply instinctive blindness, this blindness that prevents us from seeing the reality daily that things are impermanent, that particularly that sentient beings will die, So the first point of these, there's 3 points, and each of these has 3 points, 3 sub-points, but I'll just talk generally. So the first point, which we need to become familiar with, which seems so obvious, it's like a joke. Buddha tells us, Atisha tells us, that death is definite. Well, it's obvious. Nobody in their right mind would admit to believing that death is not definite. Everybody knows we're going to die. But how, in a daily sense, why are we not in touch with this? We're not. So what's the way to make this a reality for us? Well, it's to start actively observing in your daily life. You can do this in meditation, but forget that. Just do it in daily life. We know by our own observation that there's people and beings and ants and dogs and humans are dying every second. So what is it that prevents us from that being a learning? This is the whole point here. We've got to try and make it our learning. Is because death is way over there. And also when we're noticing it, it's happening to people that we don't care about much. I mean, we don't care really if the ants die. Nobody has ants for pets. If your pet died, you have a panic attack. So we see that things die all the time, never stopping. It's really absolutely evident that things die, but it doesn't become a learning for us, because it only starts to become a learning when people close to us die or our beloved pet dies. But we still don't get the learning. The real way to make this a reality for us in daily life, and it's very simple. The only way to make this a learning, which is the point of these, this is the action point, is that you see the ant die, you see the dog die, you read about the people dying. The real learning here is to simply say, that'll happen to me. That second, that's the wake-up call. But we don't do that, because it's almost like there's this hubris and it's very instinctive, of like, oh, phew, thank goodness it's not me. In other words, death happens over there. Death happens to other people. There's no way death will happen to us. It gets closer when it's our beloveds, but we still don't get the learning, because we still have this deep, like a relief. It's not me, at least it's not me. Phew. As Lama Zopa says, and we really can see it's true. Little ants. We divide the world into living people and dying people. It's fairly evident. So you think about it, you know, like we instinctively believe I'm a living person. Why? Because no one said I've got a fatal, you know, a terminal illness. No one's told me that. I feel healthy. So I assume I'm in the group called the living people. And a living person has a life, don't they? A living person has a life, and tomorrow is going to exist for that person. And you know, if you're not 97, you assume that in 10 years' time you'll be living. And even in 20 years, we prepare for our old age as if it were totally real. I'm only young. Of course, I'm a living person. I'm a healthy person. Of course, I'm a living person. We don't call it that, but it's totally instinctive, which is the buildup from countless lifetimes of believing in the lie called permanence. So just to even become familiar with, to make it real for us, that, you know, that as Lama Zopa says, we are literally, more accurately, we are a dying person. But when you say that, it's a very shocking concept, because for us, a dying person is a person who's got an illness. Mostly it's that, or they're very old and they're actively in the process of dying. That's the one we think of as a dying person. And think about this. I find this very fascinating. We can't stand the thought of dying people. We want to keep it's like a disease we do not want to know about. You know, oh my God, she's dying. And anybody who's got a fatal, you know, a terminal illness says, they talk like this. They don't even, they'd rather not talk about it, because as soon as you say, I've got a terminal illness, we can't even talk to that person. We don't know how to talk to that person. Oh, and you look at them sadly, you talk in a soft voice, you talk about them behind their back. Oh, you know, she's dying. So in other words, a dying person doesn't really exist. A dying person for us is not a real person, because they don't have this vibrance of being a living person. I mean, these are total, if we analyze it, they are total fabrications, but we so believe in these fabrications, you know. And then of course, there's this enormous hubris, this relief that I'm not in the dying people category. It's a horror for us. And this is why it's so traumatic when we learn we've got a terminal illness. I mean, it's a traumatic experience being told that you are dying. But then it's really a totally bizarre concept if you look at it logically. The real point is because we don't think we're dying. We don't know we're dying. So, you know, a person, we know perfectly well, as Lama Zopa says, and it's a really good way to put it. He says, living people die before dying people all the time. So the main one is to see the view we have in the mind, this kind of buoyancy and this positivity and this kind of, it's like a hubris, because we can't stand the thought of having the disease called dying, be a dying person. I mean, it's really very true. It's very profound how we see it. So we've got to look at that and see how it's a total nonsense. And so then, of course, this is tough for us, because then we start to think, oh, we've got to think I'm a dying person all the time. Then we think I've got to be depressed, because we don't know how to think that I'm dying and still be happy. This is a contradiction for us. The only way we think we can be a happy person is we've got a life and a future. So even if we're 60 and 70, as long as we think we've got a future, I'm not dying, I'm healthy, I'm happy, then we keep being buoyant, we keep feeling optimistic. So we've got to really do big shifts in our analysis, which really takes time to change the views in our mind. You know, they're so deeply ingrained, all of them pointing to this horror of not being me, basically. So we have to start telling ourselves the truth. I mean, and it's very hard for us, because the first thing we think is, well, that means I've got to think I'm dying. Then we assume we have to be depressed. We assume that that's the only consequence, which implies then you can't, you know, the only way to be happy is to believe you're permanent. So we've got to decide what's more valid. Is the truth more valid than our fantasy? So and the point is, the Buddha's point is this, you know, it's so interesting that not seeing reality is why we suffer. But we think by seeing reality, death only can suffer then. So it's all very mixed up in our heads. We've got to analyze it and change it day by day by day. So how then can we live with this concept, you know, of death being definite, meaning I'm a dying person? How can we live with that and at the same time have enthusiasm? Well, there's no contradiction. In fact, it's actually proving it. I think of the simple example of if you go on away, even you go away for a weekend, for a holiday, you know, a 2-day holiday in a nice hotel. Think of this, analyze this. When you get there, you know it's only 2 days, don't you? In other words, it's really impermanent. You know, it's really impermanent. You know that. But this is the interesting point. You don't go on that hotel and go to the hotel and arrive on Friday night, knowing you got to leave on Sunday night. And then you don't say to yourself, well, it's only 2 days. Why bother? You don't say that. In fact, you know, you don't say, oh, what's the point of going? It's only 2 days. The opposite, because it's only 2 days, because it's super impermanent, you will make the most of every second. You won't get to that hotel, which you paid a bucket load of dollars for this lovely 2-day vacation. You will not just go, oh, well, I might as well stay in bed and get up on Saturday and forget to get up on Saturday morning. Well, don't worry about it. I'll swim tomorrow. I'll eat tomorrow, forgetting that it's impermanent. No, but it is not permanent. But that's what grasping at permanence makes us do. We go, oh, I can't be bothered. I'll do it tomorrow. But suddenly they're going to drag you out there on Sunday night and you didn't do anything. So because it's impermanent is why we enjoy it. Think about this. When you know that your life is impermanent, therefore you got this precious opportunity. That hotel is just an analogy of something delicious, a lovely holiday. Then the logic is you do not want to waste it. You will get up early, even if you've got a headache. You'll go try all the different things. You'll go to the beach, you'll go to the restaurants, you'll make the most of it, quote unquote, because it is impermanent. That's the point. That's exactly how we'd be with our lives when we realize that we could die. We will definitely die. We will definitely die. And we know from our own scientific observation that the closer you are to 100, the less life you've got, you know, it's very clear. The further, in other words, so just these different ways we have to learn to think, train ourselves to think. Because what we don't realize, and of course, this is Buddha's point, every way we behave is based on what we think, you know. So we're trying to reconstruct our thinking, reconfigure the scripts in our mind, you know. So death is definite. I'm going to go back and forth in these points, you know. So the second one, the second point to contemplate, it ought to scare the life out of us. This second point is that the time of death is absolutely not definite. This one we just cannot bear to think. Because even if we are prepared to think that I will die, it's, you know, think about it, it's a long way into the future. You feel safe. You feel like a long way from it. So you don't have to think about it. We think like that. Oh, yeah, I'll prepare for it later. It's okay. Phew, I've got life at the moment, you know. We think like that. But it's really logical. And if we did these, we did these kind of, you know, surveys, we don't do these kind of surveys. You know, we can say with certainty, I think, that if we, you know, little ants everywhere. That many people tomorrow morning, many people who go to bed tonight, I don't know what the numbers are, how many people die every day. I don't know, maybe that has been done, that research must be there. But the number of people who go to bed tonight thinking they are a living person, no sign of illness, no sign of anything wrong, full of this belief I'm a living person, going to sleep so you're ready for the next day. I don't know whether the number of people who don't wake up in the morning, who die, who didn't know they were dying. So it's really proof that to say that you're a living person and a dying person, I mean, it's just not true. I mean, there are people who are evidently dying. You can say that's true, but to say because you haven't got a disease that you're not a dying person is a very naive, childish thing to say, but we believe it. We totally believe it, you know. And so then the point about when you're going to die, this is even too hard for us. Lama Zopa says it's best to think, I will die today. This is too shocking for us. We can't even get our head around that, you know. I know some of my friends on death row in prisons, and there's one guy, I wasn't dealing with him directly, but he, one of our other nuns was working with him, you know, and he had a death date. And it was so fascinating to observe how he had a death date, you know. And even, by the way, that's not certain. One of my friends in Kentucky, in the prison there, was on death row. And he was preparing, as usual, for his appeals, but knowing he was moving toward his death date. Supposedly more definite than us, you know, a death date. But instead, he got leukemia and died in 6 months. He died, you know, he was preparing for his death date on death row, but he got leukemia. So he died within a month or 6 months or something. So even the people on death row, their death date is not certain either, you know. I mean, I read about some guy who was executed, but he didn't die. So he was, you know, even though he was being on the table, being executed, he didn't die. So they couldn't kill him anymore. So it's like this idea that, you know, that yes, I'm going to die, but not yet. And I mean, we all know, don't we, psychologically, when we live in denial of something that is evident, it's because we can't stand it. We've got this total block. It's unbearable for us, you know, it's unbearable for us. I love this story. I always tell the story about some story you read about in the Lama from the Lamas. Some Tibetan astrologer had done his own chart, and it showed on his chart that he was going to die today. So his first instinctive response was, wow, I wonder where I made a mistake. He assumed it was a mistake because he too, like everybody else, believed he was a living person. He looked for his mistake, and the story goes something like this. I don't know, this is roughly how I've heard it. They all tell these oral, it goes down through mouth to mouth, so that stories change, you know. That he's sitting there on the something like on the windowsill with his elbow, poking his ear with something, some sharp thing. I don't know even if this is possible, but that's what the story goes. And the shut is contemplating where he made mistakes in his astrological chart. And as he's contemplating it, and somehow his elbow is banged by the shutter, and it goes in here, and he died. I mean, I found it a hilarious story. In other words, he really believed he wasn't going to die today. So all these do is prove to us how primordially deep the lie, I'm not a dying person. I mean, it should fascinate us, you know. And this is not meant to make us depressed. It's meant to wake us up. Just like on that 2-day holiday, you don't get depressed because you have to leave on Sunday night. You are prepared for this impermanent experience. And because you know you have to leave on Sunday night, you actually enjoy it more. This is the conclusion we want to come to. These little ants. I should be like Geshe Rabten. There's one meditator, Lama, one of Lama Zopa Lama Yeshe's Lamas. And he was in his cave meditating in Dharamsala for years in his little house. And he wrote about how he lived with this little family of mice, you know. I mean, totally kind. Talked about how clever these little mice were working together. And then he said, and then in order for them not to tickle my head while I was meditating, I had to wear a hat. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that so sweet? So I should have these little ants crawling all over me, you know. Allow them to have their breakfast, eat my skin or whatever they want to eat, you know. Anyway, so here we are, impermanent. The only reason to think about impermanence and death is to give us a wake-up call, so we don't waste this precious life. That's the bottom line. There's no other reason to. There's no reason to really, except for that. The time of death is uncertain. You know, we can see how we really do believe we are permanent. You know, I always use the example, when you're going on a journey, like even a 20-minute journey in the car, you know, you're familiar with that journey. You get in the car, and as you start driving towards your goal, you're moving away, aren't you, from your home? And you get and there's a feeling, you've got a sense of how long that 20-minute lasts. You feel, you know it, you're familiar with it. And there's a really vivid feeling of moving towards, like your office. You're getting closer, you're getting closer. Now this signpost, now that tree. And you feel this feeling of moving forward, this dynamic feeling of time passing and moving forward. Well, that's how we should live our life. The goal is death, because we know it's going to happen no matter what. So every day we should try and remind ourselves, you know, that I'm moving towards death. And every day you go to bed, I say that to myself, except I do say, instead of one day closer to death, I say one day closer to Amitabha's Pure Land. We're going to talk all about that, don't you worry. So one day is gone, you know. And as you're getting older, don't you notice suddenly everything goes so quickly, and all of a sudden you're getting into bed again. The next day you're getting into bed again. You can't remember anything in between. It seems to go quicker and quicker and quicker, isn't it? And I mean, in general, we can see with older people, you do get a sense of urgency because you see it's really happening, you know. So there's one of the time of death is uncertain. So what's the logic of why, as Lama Zopa says, best to think I'll die today? Let's look at why. What's the thinking behind that, which is what we're trying to get to. You see, this brings us to the third point, which is like the conclusion. It's the action point from these first two. The conclusion point, the third point is, and I'll say a few extra things, given that my consciousness came from before, given that it will leave this body when I die, more precisely, given that everything I think and do and say programs my mind, given that tendencies, negative actions, an action done on the basis of attachment, anger, and all the others will leave seeds in my mind that will produce my future suffering. And given that the virtuous actions I do will produce my future happiness, finally, given logically I don't want suffering and do want happiness, it follows logically that at the time of death, when this mind and body separate, because that's what death is, it's obvious, it's a no-brainer that the only thing that is of any use to me at that time is the virtuous karmic seeds in my mind. That's the logical deduction. So the action point is implied from that. I had better start to find the ways to not create negative karma and to create positive karma. That's it. At this point in practice, that is literally the point. So it's fairly logical if you take as your hypothesis this view of the Buddha, that things that you do, say, and think produce the person you become, and that it's not punishment and reward, but you're the boss, and that you came from before. That's it. There's the logical deductions. That's the third, that's the action point. So it's like you get your wake-up call. So the next point is you think, well, then what am I going to do about it? I better learn to know how to use this life wisely. That's it, you know. That's the essence of it. It's only the first hour. I've got 4 more classes. So now ask me some questions. Anything you want
to ask? Like to ask a question, please raise your virtual hands, or you can put these questions in the chat.
Any old question? I mean, we're going to go into all this material, of course. We're going to discuss all these things, but just some general points at the moment. Nothing to say. All right.
Silence.
I know. So see, the thing I think is to get this feeling, like I said about when you're on a journey, it's really vivid, isn't it? Except when you're a kid. You know, when you're a kid, it feels like eternity. It feels like there's never ending. You know, when are we going to get there, Mummy? Are we nearly there? You know. But this one, you know, if you've got a 20-minute journey, there's a vivid feeling of dynamic, of moving forward, of, you know, getting closer to the goal. That's a really good way to think about your life. It's a really excellent method to use, you know. Yes, Christine.
Hello, Venerable.
Yeah.
how do you help a dying friend who's not a Buddhist? What's the most important thing?
No, exactly. We're going to go into all of this. And of course, I mean, I'll answer your question, and we'll go into this in much more depth when we use Lama Zopa's book, you know. This is where it depends on the person. Let's say if they're a Christian, for example, I mean, you know, one of the key things is to help if you know that that's important for them. I mean, one of the ways to help a person who's dying, well, first of all, does this person, you have to know the person well. Is this person know they're dying, or they're living in denial of it? I mean, there's so many things. I mean, it's a general question. It's good. And Lama Zopa's book talks all about this. But is it a specific thing for you? Is it a person you know? I mean, do they know they're dying, or they're living in denial?
A friend of mine, and he knows he's dying, yes.
But she knows she's dying. Yes.
He knows he's dying, yes.
Oh, okay. So then, you know, it's like, it depends on how close you are to this person. But the key thing is you have to know, if you don't know what this person thinks, if you don't know whether this person is a communist or has a philosophy, or you don't know, you can't say too much. But so from that point of view, if you don't know what they think and don't know what their philosophy is and what their view is and what's going to happen to them, then the main thing is to be loving and kind and supportive. Because, you know, everybody has fear. We have fear because we've got this denial. So knowing that, the first thing to do is just be loving and kind. The first thing is to be supportive and loving, and to allow the person, you know, let's say you're having a conversation, and if, you know, and it's like, if you're just supportive and loving, they're going to feel more safe and more secure. And if they do want to talk about things, they'll open up to you, you know. But it's up to how much you know about this person's mind and what you think they believe and all these things. That makes a big difference. But the fundamental one is to be loving and kind. Because as soon as you're loving and kind to somebody, it heals the fear, doesn't it? Straight away. That's the most basic thing, I'd say. And then the more you know the person, the more you know what they think. And then it's like you just have to learn to have some wisdom to know how to be with that person, how to help them. But of course, the more fear we have, the more denial we have, the more disaster we would be. We won't want to be going anywhere near a dying person. You know, we don't like it. It just makes us uncomfortable. So in a sense, the more you have dealt with your own impermanence, the more qualified you are to be useful to friends. That's pretty clear, isn't it?
Yes.
All this is dealt with a lot in Lama, all the details of all kinds of things one can do depending on the person, you know. But we're going to be going into all this, Christine.
You know, it's I have no problem being with dying people, but myself, I'm very afraid for myself. So that's a contradiction, right?
Say that again. You what? You don't mind being with dying people, but what?
No, I don't mind, and I can keep calm, but for myself, I'm very afraid, you know. Can you hear me?
It's a bit difficult. Is she sounding a bit blurry for everybody else, or is it just me? Oh yeah, it mustn't be a very good connection, darling. I've got a sense of what you're saying, though. I have a sense of what you're saying. So in one sense, Christine, the key answer is the more you deal with your own reality of impermanence and understanding it, the more useful you can be to others, because there'll be no fear in your mind, and you'll just be loving and kind and be supportive, you know. And also remember, when we remember, Christine, that there's not this big distinction between you and dying people. When we just realize we're all human beings and death will come at some point or other for all of us. So that closes down this big gap between me being a living person and them being a dying person. That's really what's inappropriate, you know. Do you understand, Christine?
Yes.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, who is there? Samuel, talk to me.
Hi, so I have a question. Given that the time of death is uncertain, what is the logical and rational way to prepare towards our old age, like having a pension fund and so on?
Yeah, nothing, that's all, you know, none of this contradicts doing reasonable things like have a pension fund, prepare for your death, organize a will. All of these are very practical and helpful things to do because it makes it less complicated for the poor people who have to deal with us. You understand? Letting know your wishes. All this is really intelligent. So the sooner we do all that, the better. We need to take care of all those things. Then we don't have to worry about it. Then people know what to do with us when we die. That's helpful. That's practical. It's a reasonable thing to do. It's the worldly thing to do, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you meant? Is that your question?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
I also feel that in practice, I mean, in my heart, when I try to act in this way, then there is no contradiction. But intellectually, it seems to me that there is a contradiction between.
How do you mean? Explain the contradiction.
Well, if I would live as if I'm dying today, then, and taking this very literally, then there is no need to invest in a savings fund and so on. I can forget about it. Well,
no, if you had a compassionate attitude, you'd do it for the sake of others as well, wouldn't you? I mean, your point is totally correct. They say the greatest yogis, the really devoted, sincere practitioners will not think of any of this and will only go and practice. But, you know, 99% of us, Samuel, are not like that. So there's no contradiction that you still have a house and eat good food. In other words, because you could die today doesn't mean you sit down there depressed, waiting for it to happen. No, that would be a misconception. You still act as if you're going to live. You act as if you've got another 100 years to live, and you still eat, talk to your friends, go to work, drive the car, but will you do it within the reality that it could all end in a second? There's no contradiction if you see it properly like that. The other, you know, in other words, your implication is the only reason to do something like a pension plan is if you're going to be permanent. And you can guarantee that you'll die when you're 79 or something. No, you still do all these things, but within the reality. And we know this is true. Things suddenly change. People die overnight. Houses burn down. We get fired overnight. Things come upon us in such a shock because we know they change immediately without expectation. But you act as if. I mean, the way, for my feeling is, you know, I remember I live, you know, I try to think, I try to live my life as if I'm living for another 100 years, knowing I could, or I do my job, for example. I get a new job, let's say in this organization I'm part of, Lama Zopa's organization. When I got a job, let's say to edit Mandala magazine, I didn't know how long it would last. I thought I was going to do the job properly as if I was going to do it for 50 years, knowing the job could go tomorrow. So you've got to do it that way. Otherwise you won't build anything. I remember one Geshe Lama Kontrog said to one meditator when he had to build his house for the meditation, for the retreat, he said, you must build it properly. Do it as if it's going to last for 100 years, but know that you could die today. There's no contradiction. Then you do it properly. Because the fact is, Samuel, if we understand karma, if you live your life properly today, you know, and eat while you're eating so you can be healthy, so you can benefit others, drive to work. And so you're doing it properly within the concept of karma and cause and effect and being a good person. Then if you die today or in 20 years, those karmic seeds still go in your mind. And they will ripen later tomorrow or next life. Either way, it won't matter. Do you understand my point?
Yes.
Yeah,
so.
good.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, Linda.
Thank you. It seems like rebirth relies on the idea of continuity of mind or consciousness.
That's right.
And in this human body, I can see, it seems like the brain and memory structures would provide a continuity of consciousness, but I don't know how a person, I can't imagine a mechanism outside of a body, and I don't know how a person gains conviction that this continuity happens after death.
I understand. I mean, okay, it's a good point. it's obvious that question of yours obviously comes from an assumption of a certain philosophical position, isn't it? Which is the materialist philosophical view of neuroscience and science. And that's a viewpoint of the world. Would you agree? Isn't it? So that's your construct. That's your framework for understanding yourself. So obviously, suddenly you start listening to, say, the Buddhist view, which is a very different construct, that your consciousness isn't physical. It is not a function of the brain. It exists interdependently with the brain. He doesn't argue with that. And suddenly, so it takes a shift. It takes a while to set up a new conceptual framework. And then because it's obviously more subtle, because you can see a brain with a microscope, obviously the concept of a consciousness not being physical, and obviously the concept of a consciousness programming itself moment by moment, and then going through the death process and leaving a body and taking another body, that's obviously more subtle, but there is a conceptual framework for it. And if one is interested, one has to study that conceptual framework. And because it's more subtle and you can't cognize it immediately with our gross consciousness, you have to take it as a working hypothesis. That's the only way to do it. And then slowly, like anything, like if suddenly you hear a more advanced teaching in physics and you don't have all the conceptual framework for it now, you have to take it as your hypothesis, and then you move towards understanding it. And that's why I always stress, because we're so used to religion being something we can't believe, we can only believe and can't understand. That's not the Buddhist view at all. I mean, the Buddha's view is that if you can't finally prove something, even first intellectually, for it to be coherent, then you can say it's not true. So everything in Buddhism has to be first understood theoretically. It's got to be coherent theoretically. And I think that's how we understand with music. If you're studying Bach's music, you can get a really excellent intellectual comprehension of the musical theories. And you can logically, even without playing Bach, you can read that music pretty quickly and see whether it's valid, whether it fits within the framework intellectually. I think, and we're very good at that in our culture. We're just not used to thinking of spiritual philosophy like that. You with me?
Yes, thank you.
That's it. That's the only approach. There's no shortcut. And it's just, you have to just decide you want to look into it and slowly put together the theoretical kind of construct of this, what a mind is, what it isn't, how it functions, and that's why we study these different components, just to slowly put these pieces together. And all the time we know very well, don't we, that taking something as a hypothesis implies you might be able to prove that it's wrong or right, only one or the other. And then, as the Dalai Lama often says, us Western people, if you decide you're going to follow Buddha's methodology, in other words, my words, take it as your hypothesis, at certain points, you're checking the boxes as you go. And at some point, if you really do prove from your own direct experience that Buddha is mistaken, then of course you would reject him. So it's not just merely believing, which is very much valid in Christian, for example, religion, because you can't prove that God is right. That would be arrogant. Buddha is the exact opposite, So we've got to take it one step at a time. But in a way, and sometimes we're just intellectually lazy. We'd rather merely believe, and it seems easier, So that's just it's a bit naive. Do you understand, Linda? Thank you. Thanks, Don. Yeah. Yes, Wolfgang. Hello there. Happy to see you.
Hello,
Yes.
Happy New Year.
Yes, you too.
Based on the law of karma, there must be a deep connection between the mental consciousness and the outer world.
The which consciousness?
The consciousness.
Yes.
The mental continuity. There must be a connection.
Absolutely, total connection.
Yeah.
Go on.
And I'm interested exactly in this connection. How is it possible that my mental continuity, that my consciousness is connected to the outer world?
No, I understand exactly.
Or is there an outer world at all?
No, I know.
That's the core of my question. Is there an outer world, or is there only the consciousness?
I understand. So really, I like to talk about this, again, it's from the Vajrayana point of view. As you know, the more advanced philosophical teachings, they talk about how the physical world, like I mentioned before, the physical world is made of the 4 elements. I think we've discussed this before. The physical world is made of the 4 elements. So of course, that was a view that we had 1,000 years ago in our culture, or 800 years ago. Now we have all these other elements. If we're scientists, we don't just think of the earth, air, fire, water. It sounds like a really naive way of saying it, but that's still the model they use. And so this is the interesting point. In the Vajrayana teachings, the universe, as I said before, consists merely of matter, which is the 4 elements, and minds. That's it. Now, this is what's interesting. In the Vajrayana model, they describe how all minds are inextricably linked to their own set of the 4 elements. They're like literally inextricably linked. So this is a completely abstract concept for us, Wolfgang. It is not how we think in neuroscience, in our medical professions. It's like a bizarre idea. But this is the observation of the great yogis, that that our minds are inextricably linked to their own set of the 4 elements. So, first point. Now, second point, the Buddhist view of karma is that whatever we think and do and say, I mean, basically it starts with the mind. None of it goes astray. Everything is programmed in the mind. So now, as Lama Zopa says, so in the Vajrayana model, and when we discuss the death process, we're going to go into this, we're made up of this subtle physical energy, the subtle body and the subtle mind, and that consists of 72,000 subtle channels. And this is how they talk in the yogic system. It comes from that one, you know. They've got these 72,000 subtle channels, and our different wind energies are going through all those channels. And when you study Chinese acupuncture or the Ayurvedic system or the Tibetan medical system, they study these different wind energies. This is the basis of health. That's still the model, and we used that hundreds of years ago in our culture. Now we don't. So that's the model. And so then the wind energies are inextricably linked to all of your different states of mind. So as Lama Zopa says, let's say you have angry thoughts, just even thoughts, not even speech. Because that anger part of your mind is connected to your wind energies, that first of all programs your mind with more tendency to be angry, and programs you to be, you know, continue anger, but it also inevitably pollutes the wind energies connected to that state of mind. And that is your subtle physical energy. And eventually that ripens as your future sickness. Illness is the imbalance of the wind energies, and it's caused by the minds, the states of mind that are connected to those winds. And then in the longer term, and this is where it gets more abstract, when you die, that over many, many eons of lifetimes, that impacts upon the external elements. And this is where, when we talk about karma, which we will do more depth in the karma module, first way your intentions, your mental actions will manifest will be as a tendency, no, as a human, as a type of body. So you'll be attracted to a certain physical body, like the snake mother, due to the mind and the karma that's ripened. Second, you will, that also these actions we do will
Venerable, you're muted.
You're born where, let's say you wake up in a certain life and you've got a really polluted environment. The water's disgusting, the food is polluted, the air is bad. Then that's the karmic result of all the millions of people who are literally at that moment experiencing that polluted environment. It doesn't come from its own side. It's utterly connected to all the beings who live there. It doesn't come from a creator. So even the physical world is created over many eons of time by the actions of individual human beings with their minds. It's all explained in more depth in the Vajrayana. It's much more subtle. I'm trying to explain it simply. So the physical world is just simply the extension, is the manifestation of our own past actions. And that's why they talk about you can have hell realms and spirit realms and God realms, because they're all physicality. They're all configurations of the 4 elements that either benefit or harm the sentient being who lives in that environment. And we are the creators of all of that over many eons of lifetimes. So there's no creator, it's not random, it's not separate, it's utterly interconnected. Everything we see, even if you're born in a place, let's say, where you hear people shouting all the time, that's one of the karmic results of your own past aggression. If everything is beautiful and peaceful and harmonious, that's the fruit of your past virtue. And it's not, and that's literally how karma works. It's really at the subtlest level, it's incredibly subtle, but the whole universe is created by the sentient beings who experience that universe.
So it's really the manifestation of the thought.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But you've got to say it that it's connected to the wind energy, because physical is physical, mental is mental. They are two different entities. Mental is the four, physical is the four elements. So they can be very subtle or they can be very gross, depending on the minds.
Yeah. But via the wind energy, your thoughts can impact the elements.
Totally. And so in other words, there's four ways our karma ripens. One is the type of body you get. One is the type of mind within that body. One is the kind of experiences you have at the hands of others, because we're all very social beings. If people love you or hate you or kill you or give you things, and then even the environment. They're all the four ways that our actions ripen. The entire universe is the product of beings' minds. We don't need an external creator who sits up there giving it to us. That's a very dualistic view in Buddhism.
Thank you very much, Manoj.
Okay, thank you, Wolfgang. Yes, Christopher. Oh, 8:30 already. We can go a bit longer. Go on. Go, Christopher.
Okay. Yep. No, I just had a bit of a general question. What do you consider, like, how would you define that calling towards the Dharma coming into your life? Like, what is that process, the beginnings of true?
I think we discussed it last time, Christopher. Whatever arises in our mind, like if you wake up in this life or whatever, so when you're 15, you go to the ballet for the first time and you fall in love with ballet. You've no idea why, and you keep thinking about ballet. It's sort of evident whatever arises in our mind is because we're familiar with it. This is not even meant to be a cosmic idea. It's fairly evident. I mean, of course, it's not evident if you don't believe in reincarnation. Or why, you know, I mention often, I look on YouTube and see these little children like 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 playing unbelievable music. You can't believe their skill. It's just automatic for them because they've done it before. And exactly the same way that I remember one 19-year-old white supremacist I read about, this is years ago. And he said, when I first read Hitler, I felt like I'd come home. It was exactly, in other words, why did he say that? Because they were his tendencies in his own mind. And then Hitler was the external manifestation of what he thought already. So whatever it is, whether it's virtue or non-virtue, if we are attracted to it and want it, it's clear we've done it before. I mean, from a little girl I mentioned last time, as soon as I went to mass, I recognized the priest. I was going to be a priest. It was like so evident. It was like written. It was like directly an instruction from God. It was so clear. It was my job, you know. We're attracted to certain things. And that's why if we're trying to look into our minds, and if you're attracted to stealing, we don't just go, oh, well, it must be right. I feel like it. You check out, is that valid? Is it not? And then even if you're attracted to it, you try to change it, you know, because it's not good ethics. So whatever we are attracted to, whatever arises in our mind, whatever we like or don't like, it's due to the karmic connections with it. That's the logical reason for the Buddhist perspective, which has to imply previous lives. We can't come into this life as a blank slate. And the Buddha's view, absolutely, we have to really try and see how, you know, the idea that you get born with your mother's tendencies is a very weird idea for the Buddha. I mean, my mother was a musician, for example, a classical musician. So naturally, with the materialist model, we say, oh, well, Rabina's good at music because she got her mummy's genes. Well, no, the Buddhist view is my mother came into this life with a tendency to be good at that activity. I came into this life with a tendency to be good at that activity. And I had the good fortune to be born to a mother who could help me encourage that tendency of my own. That's the way to put it karmically.
So you think that maybe there's a big correlation between Dharma and music anyway?
Oh, no, I didn't mean it like that.
No, no.
Okay. No, I meant it like everything, whether you want to kill somebody or play the piano or become a Buddhist monk. Whatever that tendency is because you've got a familiarity with that. In other words, why that's the reasoning about karma. Yeah, you just don't come into this life with a blank slate. Whatever you want to do is a tendency in your mind. But if your tendency is you want to become a monk and want to study this, it's because you've done this before. It's very clear. Do you understand? That's the point I'm making. Whether killing somebody or being a white supremacist or becoming a Buddhist, it's the same logic. Do you see my point?
Yes, yeah. That's just been there before.
That's it, exactly. So see if it's valid, and if it is, keep doing it. If it's not, then chuck it out.
Thank you.
Okay, people, it's already gone an hour and a half, like a dream. I'm so sorry. We covered a little bit. Any more questions before we finish? Yeah. Any more questions, darling?
We have 2 short questions in the chat.
Please, talk to me.
What is the correct practice to benefit those whom are dead? People who are dead.
There's masses of that. There's plenty of things we can do now, but I'm going to be using Lama Zopa's book and highly recommend between now and next week, if you want to get it, you can get it as a digital book, I think. I highly recommend you get it. It's called How to Face Death Without Fear. It's published by Wisdom Publications. It's quite a fat book because 2/3 of it is all the practices. There's many, many practices that one could choose to do to help people at different stages. And there's lots of the advice from Rinpoche are practices to do after they've died. But I'd highly recommend, if you'd like to spend the money on this book, I really recommend, and we'll use it quite a bit in our teachings in this course, okay? What else?
Thank you.
Yes.
The last question, if I'm in a low energy state, what can I do?
Oh, sweetheart, that's not an easy answer, is it? It depends on so many things. But I mean, if you mean more like depressed, I mean, maybe if you're physically sick, that's a different discussion, you know, but it can be such a combination, can't it? I mean, I can't possibly, it's too broad a question, but if it's just a mental kind of funk, which means a bit depressed, it's not that easy. It's not that easy, but the broader point is, you know, that the mind is, you know, well, you see, depression is really just internalized aversion, the Buddhist way of putting it. Depression is a buildup. Now, if you're meaning low energy, I don't know, you didn't say. Then if it's that, you know, it affects the body because your mind and body are intimately connected. And there's no enthusiasm. We can't see the purpose in anything. It's what asleep all the time. I mean, if it's the mental state mostly, I mean, that's the result of thwarted attachment. It's hard for us to understand this, but all the time, this attachment is this part of us that always wants things to be lovely. And then when we don't get all the lovely things, the mind gets disappointed, and that builds up and becomes depression. But we don't notice it, and that's why we leave it until too late. But of course, if it's physical, I mean, it depends on what doctors you go to. You know, if you go to your Tibetan doctor, they'll give you certain herbal medicines which will energize your body, therefore help your mind. But if it's just a mental thing, I mean, there's so many approaches. And one of them, I feel, when we are a bit depressed, when we are feeling a bit of a low energy, is because we just don't think anything's worthwhile. And that's why slowly trying to see that we've got so much potential. Every single person has so much potential. We have to try and sort of, it's like we've got to sort of convince ourselves in a way, because, you know, we've got to talk to ourselves and know that there's so much we can do. It's not going to change overnight, but we've got to have this kind of, I find it very powerful, the Buddhist approach. We've all got so much potential, whereas often we don't think that in our culture. I mean, it's really hard to answer that quickly, but I mean, at least keep going, at least know there's something there, at least know you've got potential, at least know you know, and try and have enthusiasm for your own potential. Slowly. It's hard to answer that, maybe in a quick moment, but persevere. And I'll see you next week. I'll see you all next week, you people. So just read Nick Rebush's course notes. There's plenty of information in there, lots and lots of stuff. But I'd love you to also, you know, get Rinpoche's book, and we'll continue talking next week. All right, darling people. Jang Chub, Semchog Rinpoche, Ma Ke Panam, Ke Guchi, Ke Panyam Pa, Me Pa Yang, Gong Ne, Gong Du, Pelba Shog. And that means may bodhicitta, this amazing aspiration to be a benefit to others, may it grow and grow in the hearts of all. And this 90 minutes, this 100 minutes we've just had, gone like a dream. All these seconds have gone. Every moment we've created seeds in our mind. So be delighted and nourish these seeds from this moment forward with optimism, knowing they haven't gone astray. So nourish them with our efforts, with our hard work, with our meditating, with our practice, with our study, so that they do ripen in the future, no matter how long it takes, as our own amazing, marvelous potential of Buddhahood, perfection and goodness and wisdom. So we can be a benefit to ourselves and others. Thank you, sweethearts. Thank you so much, Nina, everybody, all of you, darling. Much love, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you, darling. Bye, everybody. See you very soon. Bye, sweethearts.